I'm Corey, and this is the Hardcore Skeptic Examines. Hey folks, welcome to episode 9 of the Hardcore Skeptic Examines Social Justice. In this episode, I interviewed Donna Barker, who is studying implicit bias and its impacts on our behavior and whether or not we can change it. This was a super informative interview, and Donna was a great guest. There were a couple times when I was asking her a question I had on my list, and I just couldn't believe how dumb the question sounded when you're asking somebody who's at that PhD level. It just sounds so layperson asking somebody about like science or any other subject that an educated person would know better than to ask this question. So it felt really dumb listening back during the editing process, but she was really great and answered all my questions and didn't talk down to me at all. So all in all, I think it was a great interview, and it really emphasized for me the fact that these biases, these implicit biases, are evidence-based, and that we need to figure out ways to work around them in order to create a more equitable society. Beyond that, I don't think there's much for housekeeping. I got some really good feedback from the last episode. A couple people really liked the new format, and I think that it really came across as a genuine attempt to be fair despite disagreeing with Joe. I hope listeners enjoyed it, even though the sound may not have been the best. I won't be doing the interruption thing for this interview. For me, this one was all about learning, and I hope that it is for anyone who listens as well. So here it is, my interview with Donna Barker on implicit bias. Perfect. Okay, so I guess a good place to start is with an introduction. Who are you? What's your background, and what's your interest in social justice?
Well, small question. Of course, I hadn't thought about the answer to that. My name is Donna Barker. I am currently a PhD student at Fielding Graduate University, looking at implicit bias in particular and aversive racism, both of those which I can describe a little bit. With respect to, in particular, I'm interested in people who do profess or do claim to be progressive or interested in egalitarian, a more egalitarian society. So okay. I am, not to say that I have absolutely no experience or, of course, when you're looking at this kind of research, you look at a broader scope. But my particular dissertation's on that. I have been a counselor and an educator at the university level. I've done counseling, a lot of counseling in addictions in particular, but in all kinds of issues. So that's my background. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology, a Bachelor of Social Work, a Master's of Social Work, and a Master's in Organizational Development. So I'm interested in, and then I'm currently working on a PhD in Organizational Development. Right. So I've got my foot in sort of both worlds of counseling or working with people in a kind of interpersonal way, and then also systems, institutional organizational systems. And I've done work in both areas. That describes me a bit. And I describe I call myself a scholar, practitioner, activist, meaning that I draw on all of those positions when I'm informing my work.
Okay. I guess a scholar, what do you mean by practitioner?
Practitioner means that I have been in the field doing, sort of face-to-face work with people who are, I've done counseling, for example, working with people who have personal issues, addiction issues, relationship, etc., mental health issues. I've done that both through, working in the medical system. I've had private practice, doing individual couple work. So when I say practitioner, I mean that I do clinical work, clinical intervention.
Okay. So I guess when you describe yourself as all three, then that means that you use your scholarly work and your practitioner work in your activism, and vice versa, you mix and match and use those all together to.
I really believe in, I am a skeptic, a scientific skeptic. I believe in using scientific, rigorous methodology for making conclusions and understanding how people work and in making claims. I believe people should be accountable for the kinds of claims they make about what is or isn't true, and be attempting to contribute to our knowledge in a way that isn't just coming from anecdotal evidence, and that we need to be challenging our fallacious thinking, attempting to be rational. Counseling, for example, is a field that is just absolutely rife with magical thinking and people, and sort of post-hoc thinking, people hearing a story and then making all kinds of conclusions on the basis in a post-hoc kind of a way without actually having evidence, or etc., that kind of thing. So and also one of the areas that frustrates me also in clinical work is that sometimes people are working without having a combination of kind of medical knowledge and social knowledge. So someone might be working with someone in addictions, for example, where they have absolutely no idea what is the difference between a stimulant and a depressant, or what are physical symptoms of withdrawal, or how long are the symptoms, etc. And yet they're working with the person as if what is going on is mostly about their emotional and social life, for example. So that sort of thing. I'm critical of my own field.
That's a intellectually honest way to go about things, it sounds like.
I try. I promote that.
Right. So I guess you mentioned that you're studying implicit bias. What is implicit bias?
It refers to that we and how I often start these kinds of talks, and I'm doing it here, but I do like to look at our central nervous system and how we respond, literally physiologically to cues, and how we develop that as a survival mechanism. As I was saying to you earlier, the notion of we've evolved to categorize things in certain ways and respond in ways that have helped us to survive, but it also means that we use those sort of primal cues in a way in ways that we come to false conclusions. Implicit bias refers to it was a methodology for determining associations between concepts that we form early on, often without being aware of it, and we're able to measure positive and negative associations to certain concepts. One of the things that I do when I'm demonstrating this is to have people associate the word, and this is a common one, by the way, associate, for example, the word science with female, or words that are scientific with words that are associated with female, and then switch that. And what happens is that people are able to more quickly associate the concept of science and male than they are with the concept of science and female. And that's because we've been socialized to think of men in science and women and liberal arts together. And even if we believe in egalitarianism, these are such deeply embedded concepts, we tend to associate the stereotypical associations more readily. Okay. And we do that, so I often do a demonstration in the group, and have never come across a group that didn't make that association more readily. So I am working more with race bias.
Okay.
With other biases, I'm interested in kind of all biases, but the race bias is one that interests me most. And so in the 80s, implicit bias testing was developing and developed by Greenwald and Banaji, where they have a test. You can take it. I encourage people to go to it's on Harvard website and look up implicit association test. And there are a number of different kinds of tests you can take to see what kinds of associations you tend to make. And there are at this point now millions of people who have taken this test since the 80s, and so we've got lots of data on, what are the common associations.
Right. Yeah, so it's I've actually taken that test. It's an interesting look at like where your own bias lies, even if you don't recognize it consciously.
Yeah, and hopefully, one of the things I think is good about this test is that it isn't associated with moral character or intention or all of some of the discussions about social justice and discrimination, etc., do get caught up in blaming and talking in terms of moral character and that sort of thing. And when we see that really this connects with just deeply embedded social messaging, that we're not necessarily aware of it. Some of it goes, happens pre-verbally. One of the things that I like to do when I'm talking about this is to show some videos of pre-verbal little tiny babies responding to, crying, hearing a song in a minor key, for example, or responding to facial cues at an age long before they're able to evaluate the merits of what it is they're observing or seeing or feeling. Many of these messages go in deeply early. So
that makes me think of a test I saw. I mean, it's not specifically race related, but there was a test where they would have mothers sit straight faced across from their babies, and the children got quite anxious until their mom would smile.
Yes, a perfect example of how deeply and how early. When we're infants, we're probably the smartest we ever are in our lives because we're learning so fast and our brains are developing such complex schemas so quickly. And we're also, we're like such helpless mammals at that age. I mean, we don't even roll over for months and months, while other mammals are up and walking around within a day or two, kind of thing. So we're very, we just have a way of interacting, learning about how to be in the world. And if we are, it's not too difficult to see that if we're in environments that are, if you imagine, if you think of that child and how quickly they responded to just the mother not having an expression on her face for 2 minutes.
Right.
Think of how messaging, if you're in an environment where, basically stuff is going on around you all the time, how people can be impacted. So the piece I think that implicit race or implicit bias refers to is that we're also getting messaging referring to race and gender, etc. And we may not we may not know how, what's the word? Well, I mean, if we just think about, we start talking about gender while the baby's still in the womb in the society. We're talking pink and blue before the person's even out yet. And then we start on a whole, soon as they're out in their little bassinet or whatever. We're doing a whole bunch of training around what is appropriate and what belongs to whom, and different way. And we know there's lots of research on the ways that we can very subtly be giving messages to either of the genders. Sometimes, of course, it's overt, boys do this and girls do that, but a lot of times it's just much more subtle than that. And the same is true for race and what we believe about characteristics of race. And yeah.
It seems like the kind of thing that if a person is socialized a certain way, it might be very difficult to overcome that without genuine conscious effort later in life.
Yeah, I think it helps to know, because there have been quite a few studies about how changeable are for example, with implicit race bias. How changeable is it?
Right.
And some people have said, even the people who developed tests said, I'm trying really hard not to have this reaction to, a blackface. Why do I have such a hard time putting the word, for example? And we know what these stereotypes are. When people, just as a little aside, let's not pretend that we don't know what the stereotypes are. We know that there's an assumption of lack of intelligence with dark skin, for example. It's a kind of an automatic, and that's something that's been deeply embedded, not just through the interactions between, say, the caregivers or the parents of the infant, but of course it's all everywhere in the milieu around us.
Right.
And so when we talk about, well, what difference does it make if there are Oscars so white, or if there are no representations, or if the representations are always biased in a particular way, the dark person is always the one who is following, or the dark person is always the one who gets things wrong, then I like to use the example, because I like subtle examples, like or what's a Law and Order, for example. We'll just pick one out of the blue, because they're all quite similar.
Right.
The messages in Law and Order are subtle, and they are that whenever a Black person is having a reaction to somebody being, whenever they are perceiving racism, what's really happening is that they are overreacting to something that happened to them when they were a child, and that it was a single and isolated incident, or maybe two. But now that's not a factor anymore, and they're just having some sort of overreaction, and they're going to be saved by somebody who is not racialized, who's going to explain to them what's really going on. And so I was thinking of a recent, one that I saw where, the hero is telling the Black person to, drop their gun. It's not like that way anymore. You're perceiving this wrong, and they're teaching them how to view the world and what's really happening. That kind of theme is constant.
Okay.
I think another theme that is constant, that is it's kind of mixed, is that pop culture did in some ways place different kinds of they did place some racialized people into roles of power. So they did have them as heads of hospitals, or as sergeants, or in roles of power. And two things happened with that. One is that I think the world thought that things have now changed such that there is that kind of equity in the society generally, that,
Right.
work hard and you'll get to be the head of the hospital or whatever. Number one, that it's already changed. So that's double-edged, right? On the one hand, it's have role models. On the other hand, there was the belief that that's happening all the time. And then the other messaging is always that the person who's there doesn't understand that racism is over, and that they need support to understand people's real intention. And again, it's subtle. So next time you're looking at some of those shows,
I recently listened to an episode of it's called the Secular Barbershop podcast, and he had a guest on, and they were discussing movies from the 80s and some of this these racial stereotypes that they, even as people of color, didn't recognize at the time, but now as educated adults they recognize, and after they mentioned it, then I started noticing it's like these the black best friend to the main character type of thing, like
yeah, exactly. And I think what's also important and interesting with the whole issue of implicit bias is that racialized people are biased against themselves as well.
Right.
So I've been trained in that sort of that hierarchy, and so that the bias tends to not be as high as it is with non-racialized folks, but there's definitely a large percentage who are believing believing in the bias themselves. They have the bias themselves.
Is that why you? Because sometimes you'll see videos on YouTube and whatnot of people who are racialized saying, well, racism isn't this as big an issue as people are making it out to be, or they're saying, oh, this is just being perpetuated by liberal elites or what have you, and feeding into that racism is over type of narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. And and again, I think just what we need to do is just look at the evidence, because that's and you had mentioned that the notion of what are some of the weaknesses of the left or and that's one of them, is we need to be, and anyone when we're making arguments, we need to be coming from the evidence and the research. And so that when we are able to show that the bias research is one area that's very, very strong. So we see that there's bias. I'm going to throw out a number that might not be quite right off the top of my head, but it's something like 87% of non-racialized people show a very strong preference for non-racialized people in the bias tests.
Right.
That's a big number.
Yeah, no kidding.
So, and it's not as high for racialized, but so there's a bias. And then there's a lot of research. And when I say a lot of research, we're now talking, sort of thousands of studies. And then there's a lot of research that indicates that there's a high correlation between high bias and certain kinds of differential behavior towards racialized groups. So all kinds of tests to show all kinds of behaviors in healthcare, in employment, in just observing behaviors, eye contact. I mean, there's just so much research to indicate the correlation between high bias and the impacts of that bias. And then when looking at the impacts of the bias, we can look at interpersonal interactions. So we can look at things like people, for example, we can look at things like people reporting that they feel like they're being treated in a kind of, in a certain way, being treated with a certain amount of disrespect. And then we can look at the correlation of reporting, feeling that way, to the correlations with high bias. There's just all kinds of ways to look at that. But I also...
So it's not there's no, like you say, there's no post-hoc rationalization. There's a comparison of two sets of data and drawing kind of a conclusion from that, in a sense.
Exactly. So, and that's what we need to do, just like what we also need to do as, skeptics, is to look at, because sometimes looking at the interpersonal data isn't enough. right? In the sense that in a particular job interview as an individual, one-to-one, I can't know if somebody is having a bad day or if they're uncomfortable or if they just don't like me for some reason.
Right.
I don't know if that is racism. But what I can know is that if we step back and look at 200 hirings, then we can see, is there a difference between two people who have the same qualifications? Is there a difference between who gets hired in terms of those numbers? And of course, there have been those studies done where people go in with the same qualifications, and right now the numbers look like the non-racialized person gets the job about 3 times
Right.
or to the racialized person, and that's still current. I think I heard you mention that study about names.
Oh, yep.
Yeah. There are others, many more others, where they actually have pairings of people going in. They have that for housing. They have that for, there are studies on differential diagnoses, or not actually diagnoses, but referrals to pain medication even.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Lots of quite a few medical studies, different referrals to service, many things like that. So
right. So it's apparent that this is a trend across. This is just a statistical trend, not just individual people taking behavior out of context.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to look at interpersonal. There's the different levels, right? There's the person that you were describing that is the intrapersonal, where they sort of have internalized false beliefs about themselves or their own sort of group.
Right.
And then there's the interpersonal, where there are effects that occur in terms of people interacting with each other. And then there are, when you step back and look at the, organizational or institutional or at those levels. And another example of taking that step back, broader perspective is wage gaps. We see wage gaps by race.
Right.
The wage gaps by, often people want to say, well, that has more to do with immigration. So then when we look at, okay, well, non-racialized immigrants don't have the same wage gaps after a certain amount of time as racialized people do. And then if we go into second generation, we see that the gap continues. We see that the gap, so the second generations, we're not talking language or unfamiliarity with the culture or anything like that. Yet there's still that inequality. In fact, lots of, I'm getting a little fuzzy off the top of my head, where I just want to be careful that I'm clear when I'm not talking about a specific research that I'm thinking of at the moment, or specific results, but I am recalling data about higher levels of education for second generation racialized groups, and I'm not remembering the numbers right now, but that again, there's a gap. There's not. So yeah. So those are important numbers, and I think that's what we go with, rather than just people sort of wanting to argue about yes it is, no it isn't.
Right. Yeah. I actually have to look at the numbers and see what's actually happening.
Mm-hmm. Another I think related issue has to do with what is race.
Right. That's a fair question.
Yeah, that's pretty messy and muddy, and the answer is that, of course, sometimes that is a problematic definition, because sometimes people identify with a racial group even though they aren't visually necessarily somebody who would be recognized as being part of that group. It's more a cultural identification.
Okay.
And for some, there's the visual clues. When we're talking about implicit bias, we're talking about the visual cue.
Right.
In terms of what what is it that people respond to visually. And so I'm in support of the idea when we're talking about race to have people, of course, identify with who they feel they identify with, but also asking the question, if you're walking down the street, what race do people think you are? Or what race do your friends think you are? Or a question that speaks more to the visual, because that's where, if we're talking about implicit bias, we are talking about the visual cue, right? The visual. So, and it changes in different societies, right? What's considered a race.
It seems there has been some discussion on the success of, say, lighter skinned African American actors, or more Caucasian looking, or perhaps even mixed race, Native First Nations people, sort of stuff like that. Like it seems like it's a matter of degree, this implicit bias, right? Like
yeah, well, it depends. Yeah, it depends, because you're right that there's a hierarchy of acceptance or association with certain characteristics on the basis, like you say, of the visual cue, and who can sort of quote pass as being non-racial, sort of thing. And you were talking about, 80s movies, and, in those movies, you may have noticed that the more successful person would be the lighter one, and the best friend would be, the dark, or, that kind of thing.
Right.
Even if it was they were racialized. So yeah, there is a hierarchy, and you're right about that.
So I guess, how do we apply some of this implicit bias research into the way we deal with social justice issues? Or is that just such a large question?
A start is to recognize it. I'm kind of, I'm a little bit dismayed by how large this body of research is.
Right.
How much there has been for decades, and how little it has trickled into our social activism, into, it just hasn't been disseminated. And that's surprising to me. Because I think it helps to know. If we know that we have biases and that we're not necessarily aware of them, then that can inform the decisions we make about trying to create, for people who care about equality. If people don't care about equality, I'm not talking to you.
Right.
I'm talking to people who are looking to develop fair and equal, access to resources for all. That's who I'm talking to.
Right.
And if we want to do that, then we do need to take into account that there is bias, and we have to assume that it is operating. And if we assume it's operating, then we can look to try and find processes that can help to equalize things more. I think of the example of what was done in many symphony orchestras, for example, where the symphony orchestras were all male for a long time, and people kept insisting that men played differently, and that's why this was happening. There's just something about how they play, or it's just a little bit stronger, it's a little bit more something, until they started to put screens in front of the people auditioning so that they didn't know what the gender of the people auditioning was. And lo and behold, and for a while it wasn't working, until they realized you have to put the curtain all the way down to the ground, and then you have to put carpet up to the seat so that you can't hear the shoes.
Right.
And now we see many of the orchestras being 50-50, if not more. So, similarly, there's much more of a race mix as well in orchestras, for that reason, that they made an assumption of bias, found a technique to mitigate that, and that created much more fairness for everyone. It's a good example of how bias operates.
Yeah, I quite like that as an example of how implicit bias can be dealt with in a productive way to end up with the best possible diversity without anyone saying, oh, well, I guess I'm not sure where I'm going with that. I just really like that that particular way of mitigating that.
Yeah,
I guess
that's done in certain as well in certain academic circles as well, where there's blinding of when research is being evaluated,
right?
trying to blind, because similarly, two papers submitted. One paper has a name on it that looks, a female name and a male name, and they are evaluated quite differently. Same paper, right?
Right.
That's more research on that. Where similarly by race, if a paper is deemed to have been written by a Black person, for example, it will get a lower evaluation rating on a whole bunch of criteria. Most of them, of course, being subjective.
Right.
A same paper, but a bias on the basis of whom they think wrote the paper. So finding, again, ways that assume that bias is operating and trying to mitigate that is one of the ways to create more fairness. Yeah.
So I guess one of the criticisms of social justice that I've come across is the idea that when we try to mitigate our biases or our societal or help groups that have traditionally been disadvantaged,
mm-hmm.
are we then sometimes harming non-racialized people? Like, I guess in a way, the criticism has been, does affirmative action type things like that, does that harm the overall quality of the work? I guess it seems like if we are mitigating for implicit bias rather than say just saying that we need quote unquote quotas of minority people, then that affects that would bring the overall quality of whatever work happens to be going on up, and still would offer opportunities to people who normally wouldn't get those opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're going to talk, when we're talking about bias against a group, I think we also need to understand that the corollary is that another group is getting benefits. Right. And we aren't using an understanding of research methodology and critical thinking and fallacious thinking and the scientific method. If we're not using those as part of how we are describing the inequality, then people aren't going to understand it.
Yeah.
And so some of the things that occur quite quickly are that people feel blamed, and
right.
they feel they're being singled out as being evil, and all of these kinds of things. And if they understand, it's just like I don't have any trouble hearing that, we're going to look at, grades or something. I mean, like whatever the criteria is, if it's fair, we could get into all kinds of discussions about what's fair and what processes need to be granted. But the overall notion of sometimes there is unfairness, and it's difficult for people to recognize that unfairness unless they understand the process by which those claims, those conclusions come, then we're stuck continually going back to square one.
Right.
And, racism exists, and we just keep to square one.
Yeah, which seems like we're back there now. Like it seems like we have to go back to this racism exists type mentality now.
Yeah, and so that's where my criticism of the quote left, or sometimes you mention that notion. There were two streams, I think, of change, and so one of the problems I think with the left has been, and you were talking about postmodernism a little bit, and there has been a certain let's go with the including voices meant, or inclusion sometimes meant everything goes, every position is has merit.
Right.
Subjectivity is or anecdotal evidence is evidence for the general or the overall, that sort of thing, and also magical thinking. I mean, I just think the whole New Age think positive, and you will get, you will get what you put out, and all this kind of magical thinking. If you, you hear people say things like, if you think positive, as if the whole entire universe is going to is A, conscious, and B, is going to change its function on the basis of whether or not you have a positive thought or behave nicely towards somebody today. But there's a lot of this kind of nonsensical thinking that has not helped us get to a more rational, rational conclusions about, and that hasn't necessarily supported rigorous evidence.
It's
thinking.
like there's a skit on the Amy Schumer show where it was, the universe is actually just a place to grant a thing out there to grant the wishes of 20-something white women.
Yeah. Yeah, and then there's just so much of that, just and karma, the way
right,
that stuff. And so that's been, I mean, the baby boomers and the generations behind that have really pushed this non-critical thinking, and so there's been a reduction of religious magical thinking, but there's been a real increase in this other spirit conscious universe thinking. I think has just kept us in the same soup of irrational. And I think that's one of the reasons why we are where we are today. There's still and people still that's kind of a silly broad statement to make, but I think it's one of the reasons we haven't moved forward socially, and why we're back in some ways to square one.
It does seem like if there was more evidence-based thinking, then maybe we wouldn't always be backtracking these same points all the time.
Yeah.
I guess one of the things that we didn't really discuss was this idea of reverse racism, or racism against whites, or I'm not sure if that's even the right word to use, but is that something that can be kind of contributed to, or implicit bias kind of contribute to that as well? Or is that even really a thing that happens very much?
I mean, my first question would be, what reverse racism? Where is there evidence of racism?
I guess most people have individual examples of what they would say is, you have this example of a group of black people saying that they want whites to die or whatever they want. So they call that like this, I guess they call that reverse racism. I'm not really sure what the right way to call that is, but I wonder, is that a reaction to, is that just a reaction to the already unequal society, or is that a result of another type of bias, or another type of I guess bias or attitude?
I mean, I think so if we're talking about sort of individual bad behavior, then we are talking about an individual bad behavior. I don't know about groups of people, black people, saying they want to kill white people or whatever as a movement. I haven't seen that. If it's there, if there are individuals who are not nice people, that's I wouldn't doubt that. I don't doubt that at all. I think what I'm looking at is the systemic impacts, so that if 70% of people who go for medical care are receiving inferior medical care on the basis of objective criteria, then that's of concern. and let's try to do things that will create, that will, take that inequality away. That's another reason why I like to be at the objective level.
Yeah.
Because any individual saying something that's not nice to any other individual is, that's
an individual.
That is an individual thing, and it also makes a difference if there are, again, if we're talking stepping back and doing big, broader numbers, and we say, well, actually, if you're able to say to me, well, 90% of Black people say they hate white people and they stop them from having food or something.
Right.
Oh, okay, that's a problem. That's inequality. We have some data that's treating people badly in a way that impacts a group, and so we should do something about that. And I'm happy to, sort of work with that.
Right.
But in terms of the notion of every time, it was. I think I made my point.
Yeah. I think you made a fair point. It seems like there's two different things being talked about, isn't there? Like you've got on an academic level, like people often discuss things on statistics and like on a broad policy type mentality, like how do we fix society in this way? And quite often the criticisms come from people who are very focused on individual actions and very focused on behaviors on a small scale. And
so not to completely ignore that or take that out, as I said, that the notion of sort of interpersonally mediated or interpersonal interactions are important, but we can't. It's difficult to focus at that level because we can't know in any particular interaction whether or not, what are all the factors that are playing into that. So,
right.
And so it's pretty difficult to intervene at that level in terms of racism, and to talk about racism in terms of as though it's defined as individual discrete acts that sort of have a beginning and an end and are happening between two people is pretty difficult way to get any kind of it's not a very useful way to talk about racism, even though of course it can be happening, and if it's clear, it's like if somebody says, I don't like you because you're Black.
Right.
Not really how it happens anymore. Then okay, so you're dealing with racism in that situation, but it's very difficult to know, and again, that's why I like the bigger picture.
That's fair enough. I think I've taken enough of your time. Is there anything that you'd like to maybe make a point about in closing?
I think we didn't mention the concept of aversive racism, which is a funny term. It's a strange term, but I think it's an important concept, and it's related to implicit bias, and it's also something that people tend to be unaware of. And I just want to describe that.
For sure.
There's a lot of research on that as well. Knows that the video a number of, but anyway, and that refers to when, and this is actually mostly be done with non-racialized people. It refers to when someone professes egalitarian values, but actually behaves in a way that is the opposite of those egalitarian values. And what happens in those situations is that, and I'll give you two examples just to describe the concept. So where it was first discovered was in a study that was done in the 80s, where people who were describing themselves as, one group was describing themselves as egalitarian, the other was describing themselves as conservative. So you're free to argue about those those categories. It's problematic. It was also way back then, but they had already sort of suggested that they had these kind of values anyway. And what they did was they had a Black person. Now this was in the days before cell phones and things. So this was in dial phones,
Yeah.
right? So when they were in phone booths and they phoned, so a black person phones the white person and says, my car is broken down, and says, oh, I'm sorry, it sounds like I've got the wrong number. I was trying to phone a tow truck company, and can you please call the tow truck company for me? So they phoned this person, pretended that they had a wrong number, but had actually, anyway, so they pretend they had the wrong number, and the person, and then they looked at the responses. So what they found is that when the black person phoned someone who had said that they were egalitarian, well, actually somebody who said they weren't, the person tended to just hang up right away. Or sorry, that's wrong. They listened to the argument, and then they just sort of said, no, just you'll have to phone yourself, or they would just hang up. So start again. Sorry, black person calls white, quote, quote, conservative, tells a story, and then the conservative more often would just sort of say no and hang up.
Okay.
When I say, and also the other thing is, of course, that it was a voice that sounded stereotypically black, or it sounded like a black person.
Right. They had to be able to tell that it was
They had to be able to tell that it was a black person, which we know is not that difficult in some cases, right? So if they called a person who considered themselves egalitarian or liberal or whatever the terms were in those days, what they found is that the liberal would hang up before they got a chance to hear what the argument was.
Oh.
So that was curious.
Yeah.
It was like, what is that? And then the white person calling, or the white sounding voice calling, got help from both groups.
Of course.
They listened to the argument, got help from both groups more often, right? So, and the person would say, can you please call, I don't have another quarter, etc. Anyway,
Right.
so that was curious. Why did that happen? So later, more studies were done, and I'll give you an example of how this played out. What would happen is that people who saw themselves as egalitarian would, if there was now there are two people applying for the same, more or less the same job. In some cases, they did one study where they were applying for a position at a university to be allowed into the university as a student. In another case, they did an employment one. Anyway,
okay.
So if the people had different levels of, what's the word I'm looking for, qualifications, one had very high and one had very low, then the decision was fairly easy. The person with the very high qualifications would be accepted.
Okay.
If the people had similar qualifications, so the black person, white person had similar qualifications, both groups would still hire or include the non-racialized person or the white person at a rate of about 3 or 4 times more often.
Okay.
The person who just didn't, was just kind of explicitly biased and didn't, just sort of say, I like this person better, or I like these people, or we need to protect ourselves, or whatever. They would just include that person. However, the person who claimed that they were egalitarian would come up with a justification. And the justification would always be some kind of a changing of the goalposts.
Right.
So they would say, well, I'm taking this person because we really need somebody who has more experience. And this person didn't have experience. But if the white person had less experience, they say, you know what, we're looking for new blood. We're looking for somebody who has more, is bringing in new ideas. So
right.
The egalitarian person would still choose the white person, but they would come up with a justification that would change the goalposts. There are a few other, I'm trying to think of another one. There was another study where people would say that they would, I'll leave that study out for now. But,
sure.
Anyway, the point being that people who, and that's another reason why I find it interesting to be looking at people who are claiming to be or wanting to be egalitarian, progressive, support those kinds of values. If they're not aware that they are likely to still have this kind of bias and make these kinds of decisions without being aware of it, then the inequality will continue. And so unless people know that, then that's one of the reasons why, again, I want for this kind of evidence to be presented to people. It's not just enough to say you have the intention, because you also need to know that you're likely to change the goalposts. Unless you know
right.
that you're likely to change the goalposts. And it's not about you being a bad person or anything. It's just this hierarchy is deeply embedded. There's no secret. We can't pretend that we don't know who's at the top in the high rise, in the boardrooms, and who's cleaning the basement. Let's not pretend that we don't know that there are different people there, and that this has to do with deeply embedded visual.
Right.
It's not, because that's what it is. It's visual. It's not. There aren't other things, and that everybody is part of the. Everybody's involved in it. It's not just one group everybody's in the dance.
Right. Nobody's immune, eh?
Nobody's immune, and everyone is kind of complying. Like when we were talking about internalized, the people in the basement are also internalizing and putting themselves or in that role. And there's always the resistance. There's no question. There's the folks at any level that are resisting and saying, this isn't fair, or I don't like this, or I don't like being treated this way. It's subtle. But we know that the bigger system is operating and maintaining these.
Sure.
So I just wanted to get this. I just want to make sure I got the aversive racism definition, because it's
an important topic, I think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
All right. Is there anything that you a place where people can find your work, or do you do anything online?
Yeah, I'm just setting up a company called Free Thought Counseling and Consulting, and those are two different wings. I've done quite a bit of consulting in the past, and then and also the counseling. The counseling is I'm looking to work with people who are looking for a free thought counselor who isn't going to talk to them about spirituality and so for people who are either who are looking for evidence-based, pragmatic,
right.
Very experienced, because I've been doing this for decades, counseling. And so, that's one stream. And then, of course, there's the consulting in this implicit bias and organizational change kinds of issues as well. So I actually am just in the process of getting it online, but I can give, a number where I. My counseling, by the way, is I'm doing the counseling online. Okay. So through Zoom software, and not in an office, and I'm doing that because I do find that people both are that people who are wanting this kind of service are kind of all over the place, and they find me by. They're not geographically co-located. And also that, if folks are traveling or moving around, it can be, it can be helpful to be able to still have sessions. Sometimes also people are not necessarily co-located with, say, family members if they're wanting to talk with, have say children or ex or that kind of thing, to have some kind of a meeting where people are not necessarily in the same place. So I'm doing it doing it online.
Like a very worthwhile thing to do. That's evidence-based counseling is something that's seems to be lacking in a lot of places.
Yeah, and similarly with addictions work, like I was saying earlier, that there's just so much snake oil out there, and so I'm working to mitigate.
Right. I might have to get in touch with you if I ever do an episode on AA or NA and stuff like that.
Yeah, I actually do an education, a 6-part education series on addictions and harm reduction and the drug war,
right?
And the sort of basic neuroscience around substances, and I course at the Justice Institute as well on that. So
right on. Well, thank you very much. So that's the end of that interview. I hope you enjoyed it and learned as much as I did. I'll try to have links for as many of the studies that were referenced as I can. Donna was kind enough to sift through hundreds of studies for a few that were directly relevant to our discussion. Again, I can't thank Donna enough for talking to me about this. I think it's a subject that has a lot of empirical data supporting it, but that many people don't really know about or understand. I'll try very hard to get another episode out before I go on vacation. I know that I haven't always been on time for one reason or another, and I feel really terrible about that. I try hard to do this show whenever I have the chance, but with 2 kids and a partner who's a teacher, it basically means no time to myself during the summer unless I'm at work. Speaking of my vacation though, I'm going to be in the Toronto area from the 9th to the 13th of August. So if you want to get in touch with me, shoot me a message on Facebook or email me at mail@brainstormblog.net and maybe we can grab a beer or something. You can find more of these episodes at Spreaker.com/show/The Hardcore Skeptic Examines. And you can find me on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and just about anywhere else you can find podcasts. Make sure to follow me on Twitter at Hardcore Skeptic and like my Facebook page, facebook.com/Hardcore Skeptic. I really appreciate any shares, any likes, any help you can give to promoting this show and to getting the information that I'm gathering out there. If you want to support my work, you can become a patron at patreon.com/Hardcore Skeptic. Thanks so much to the patrons of this project: Chris Watson of the Podunk Polymath Podcast, Marissa Alexa McCool of the Inciting Incident Podcast, and Trav Mamone of the By Any Means Podcast. Remember to check out my other show, The Brainstorm Podcast. You can find it at thebrainstormpodcast.com or brainstormblog.net. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth matters.